Emily adjusted the stack of reports on her desk, her fingers lingering on the smooth paper as if savoring the finality of another long workday. The muted hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the soft whir of her computer were the only sounds in the otherwise empty office. She glanced at the clock, 6:30 p.m. It was late, but she didn't mind. Her role as senior accountant at Ridgefield Construction kept her busy, and she thrived in the structure it brought to her life. The numbers never lied. They were consistent, predictable, and offered the stability she often craved. Her coworkers joked that Emily was born to be an accountant, but in truth, her love for numbers came from a deep-rooted need for control, a way to make sense of a chaotic world. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen, her lips curving into a soft smile. A message from Nate. "I'll be late tonight. Big delivery at the dealership. Don't wait up." That was Nate. Always considerate, always keeping her in the loop. After 11 years of marriage, they had settled into a comfortable rhythm. He worked as the manager of a premium car dealership on the other side of town, a demanding job that often kept him late. Emily didn't mind. She had her routines, her work, and her quiet evenings at home. Home. Just the thought of their little house brought a wave of contentment. The two-story colonial in the suburbs wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs. 5 years ago, they had emptied their savings and signed the mortgage papers together, hands trembling with excitement and nerves. The house had become their sanctuary, a place filled with memories, barbecues in the backyard, quiet evenings watching TV, and lazy Sunday mornings with Nate making pancakes, while Emily sipped her coffee at the kitchen counter. The phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from Sarah, her best friend since college. It was a candid shot from their anniversary dinner last month. Nate was leaning across the table, smiling warmly at Emily while she laughed at something he had said. Sarah had captioned it, 11 years of love and laughter. Emily sighed, saving the photo to her phone. That dinner had been perfect, steak, wine, and quiet reminiscing about the years they had shared. She hadn't known then that she would soon cling to that memory like a lifeline. Gathering her things, Emily turned off her computer and stepped out into the cool spring evening. The parking lot was mostly empty, the street lights casting long shadows across the pavement. She decided to make a quick stop at the grocery store before heading home. Inside the store, Emily moved methodically through the aisles, picking up the essentials: fresh vegetables, Nate's favorite cheddar cheese, a loaf of whole grain bread. She paused by the flower display, her eyes drawn to a bundle of sunflowers. They reminded her of the ones Nate had bought her on their first date, a gesture that had felt both sweet and bold. Without hesitation, she added them to her cart. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the sky had deepened into twilight, the last hues of orange fading into indigo. The house stood quietly, its warm porch light glowing like a beacon. Emily carried the groceries inside, the faint scent of lavender greeting her as she opened the door. Their home was simple, but filled with touches of their personalities. The living room held Nate's collection of vintage car magazines neatly stacked on a coffee table, while the bookshelves displayed Emily's favorite novels and a framed photo from their honeymoon in Maui. She placed the sunflowers in a vase and set them on the kitchen counter, stepping back to admire how they brightened the room. Cooking was Emily's way of unwinding. As she chopped vegetables for a salad and seasoned chicken breasts for grilling, her mind wandered to the weekend ahead. They had talked about visiting the farmer's market and maybe planting new flowers in the backyard. Nate wasn't much of a gardener, but he always humored her enthusiasm, joking that he was her official water guy. By the time dinner was ready, it was close to 8. Emily sat at the table, her fork idly pushing salad greens around her plate. Nate's absence was never unusual. He often came home late during big deliveries. But tonight, for some reason, she felt a strange tug of loneliness. To distract herself, she opened her laptop and began browsing for vacation ideas. They had been talking about a trip to the coast for years, but had never gotten around to planning it. Nate always insisted they should just pick a date and go, but Emily preferred to research every detail. As she scrolled through pictures of seaside cottages and oceanfront resorts, she made a mental note to bring it up again this weekend. When Nate finally walked through the door, the scent of grilled chicken still lingered in the air. He looked tired, but greeted her with a warm kiss on the forehead. "Smells amazing," he said, loosening his tie. "Just something simple," Emily replied, pouring him a glass of iced tea. "Long day?" "Normal," Nate said, sitting down with a sigh. "We got a shipment of 20 new cars. Paperwork took forever." As they ate, they talked about their days, a conversation that flowed easily after years of practice. Emily told him about a funny mishap at work involving a mislabeled spreadsheet, and Nate teased her about being a numbers nerd. It was an ordinary evening for an ordinary couple, but Emily cherished the simplicity of it. Later, as they settled in the living room, Emily with a book, Nate scrolling on his tablet, she looked over at him and felt a surge of gratitude. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs, built on years of trust, laughter, and small gestures of love. "Nate," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "what do you think about taking a trip to the coast this summer? Just us." He glanced up from his screen, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Sounds like a plan. Let's look at dates tomorrow." Emily nodded, already imagining the sound of waves and the feel of sand beneath her toes. She didn't know that tomorrow, and the days to follow, would change everything. For now, she placed her book on the coffee table and rested her head on Nate's shoulder, letting the steady rhythm of his breathing lull her into a sense of peace. It was moments like this that she lived for, small, quiet fragments of a life she thought would last forever. The scent of antiseptic filled the small examination room as Emily fidgeted in her chair, her fingers nervously tracing the strap of her purse. The last 2 weeks had been a blur of exhaustion, lightheadedness, and nausea. She had dismissed it as stress from work, combined with the unpredictable spring weather. But when the nausea had turned into morning sickness, her best friend Sarah had urged her to see a doctor. "It's probably just a bug," Emily had assured herself. "Or maybe I'm just overworking." Now, as she sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, her heart thudded with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Dr. Grant, a kind-looking man in his 40s, entered the room with a clipboard in hand. He gave her a reassuring smile before sitting down across from her. "Well, Emily," he began, "your blood work came back. I have good news." Emily straightened, her mind racing. "You're pregnant," he said with a warm smile, "about 6 weeks along." Her breath caught in her throat. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, intertwining with a flurry of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of wonder. "6 weeks?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Grant nodded. "That would put the conception right around mid-April. Does that sound right?" Emily's eyes widened as she remembered their anniversary weekend. They had gone away to a charming countryside inn, a rare break from their busy schedules. It had been a weekend filled with laughter, quiet moments by the fireplace, and the kind of closeness they didn't always have time for anymore. "Mid-April," she repeated, a smile beginning to form. "Yes, that makes sense." As she left the clinic, clutching a packet of prenatal information, her head swam with possibilities. She had never considered herself maternal. She and Nate had always said they weren't in a rush to have kids. Maybe someday, they joked. But now, the idea of a little life growing inside her filled her with a profound sense of purpose. Driving home, Emily imagined how she would tell Nate. She pictured his expression, the way his face would light up when he heard the news. Nate loved children. Whenever their neighbors' kids played outside, he would stop to chat with them, always quick with a joke or a story. That evening, Emily set the stage for what she hoped would be one of the happiest moments of their lives. She stopped at the store to pick up his favorite cut of steak, fresh asparagus, and a bottle of sparkling apple cider. She even found a tiny onesie that read, "Coming soon," in bold letters. Back home, she lit a few candles, played soft jazz on the speakers, and set the table with their good dishes. As she cooked, her excitement grew. This wasn't just dinner, it was the beginning of a new chapter. When Nate walked through the door around 7, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one shoulder, he paused in the entryway, taking in the scene. Wow, he said, smiling. What's the occasion? Just wanted to make you something special, Emily replied, her voice light. They sat down to dinner, and as they ate, Emily studied him. He looked tired, more so than usual, but his easy smile and quick wit were as comforting as ever. After dessert, Emily couldn't wait any longer. She reached under the table and pulled out the tiny onesie, handing it to him with trembling hands. What's this? Nate asked, raising an eyebrow as he unfolded the fabric. His eyes scanned the words, and for a moment, his face was unreadable. Then, his expression shifted. His jaw tightened, and he set the onesie on the table as if it were fragile. I'm pregnant, Emily said softly, her voice tinged with excitement. We're going to have a baby. Nate stared at her, his fork frozen in midair. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. I need some air, he finally muttered, pushing back his chair and walking out the front door. Emily sat there, stunned. She had imagined many scenarios, tears of joy, a celebratory hug, maybe even a playful joke about baby names, but not this, not silence. The minutes stretched into an hour. Emily busied herself cleaning the kitchen, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Had she said it wrong? Was he upset about the timing? When Nate finally returned, he found her sitting on the couch, a book open on her lap, though she hadn't read a single word. I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy. It's just a lot to process. I didn't mean to upset you. It's okay, Emily replied, though her heart still felt uneasy. I know it's unexpected, but aren't you happy? He pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. Of course I'm happy, he said, but something in his tone didn't match his words. Over the next few days, Nate seemed distant. He went to work early, came home late, and avoided the topic of the baby. Emily tried to give him space, convincing herself that he just needed time to adjust. Then, one fateful afternoon, everything changed. Emily was in her office when her phone rang. It was Sarah. Emily, Sarah said, her voice trembling, you need to get to the hospital. Nate, he collapsed at work. The drive to the hospital was a blur. By the time she arrived, it was too late. The doctors told her he had suffered a massive heart attack and died almost instantly. No, Emily whispered, shaking her head. That can't be. He was fine. He was just tired. She collapsed into a chair, her hands clutching her stomach as the weight of the news pressed down on her. Nate, her partner, her love, the father of her unborn child, was gone. The funeral was a somber affair. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors gathered to pay their respects. Emily stood near the casket, numb, as people offered condolences. But it was the arrival of a stranger that shattered her fragile composure. A tall, striking blonde woman in a tailored gray dress approached, her expression cold and businesslike. Mrs. Miller, she said, her tone sharp. I'm Rachel Donovan. I need to speak with you. Emily frowned. I'm sorry, who are you? I'm the owner of the house you're living in, Rachel said, holding out a stack of documents. Nate signed it over to me 2 weeks ago. You have 24 hours to vacate. Emily's world tilted. The house? Their house? She stared at the papers in disbelief, the signatures glaring back at her like a betrayal. This is a mistake, she stammered. Nate would never... It's no mistake, Rachel interrupted. Check the documents. Everything's in order. As Rachel turned and walked away, Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. The man she thought she knew, the man she had built her life with, had hidden a secret so devastating it threatened to destroy everything they had created together. Tears blurred her vision as a single question echoed in her mind. Why? Emily sat at the dining room table, the documents Rachel had handed her spread out like a cruel mosaic of betrayal. Her hands trembled as she traced Nate's signature on the papers that declared Rachel Donovan the rightful owner of the house she and Nate had built their life in. This has to be a mistake, she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Nate would never do this. But the papers didn't lie. The seals, the notarized stamps, and most painfully, Nate's unmistakable signature. Everything was in order. Rachel's smug face at the funeral replayed in her mind, her cold words like a dagger twisting in Emily's chest. The house, their house, was no longer hers. Determined to make sense of the unthinkable, Emily retreated to Nate's office. It had always been his space, filled with his books on car sales, automotive magazines, and a cluttered desk he had jokingly called organized chaos. Now, it felt like a foreign land, each item a relic of a life she was beginning to realize she hadn't fully understood. Pulling open the first drawer, Emily found nothing unusual: receipts, pens, and a spare set of keys. But as she delved deeper, she discovered an envelope tucked beneath a stack of files. Her breath hitched when she saw Nate's handwriting scrawled across it, for Emily. Her heart pounded as she tore it open. Inside was a letter written in Nate's familiar script, dated just days before his death. Emily, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything to you. I can't begin to express how sorry I am. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and they've put everything we built together in jeopardy. I fell into something I couldn't control, and I betrayed you in ways I never imagined I could. You didn't deserve any of this. Rachel, she wasn't supposed to mean anything. What started as a business relationship spiraled into something else, something I couldn't stop. I know that doesn't excuse what I've done. She manipulated me, Emily. She saw my weaknesses, played on my insecurities, and convinced me to do things I'll regret for the rest of my life. She made me sign over the house. I thought it was temporary, something I could undo once I figured out how to fix things. But then I found out you're pregnant, and suddenly everything became clear. I had to fight to take it all back. I went to the notary last week and annulled the transfer. The house is still ours. I have the documents to prove it, but I didn't want to tell you until I dealt with Rachel for good. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know this. I love you. I love you and our baby more than anything. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Tears blurred Emily's vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. She had been so angry, so confused, but this letter revealed a man grappling with guilt and desperation. Nate had tried to protect her, to fix the mess he'd created, but he hadn't lived long enough to see it through. Her grief now mingled with determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future Nate had wanted for their family. The next morning, Emily contacted Sarah, her best friend, who wasted no time showing up with coffee and a notepad. "We're going to figure this out," Sarah said, her tone firm. "First, we need a lawyer, a good one." Emily nodded, clutching the letter. "And I need answers. I need to know who Rachel really is and why she's doing this." That afternoon, Emily and Sarah sat across from Jack Hayes, a seasoned attorney known for his meticulous attention to detail. Jack listened intently as Emily recounted everything: the funeral, Rachel's shocking claim, and Nate's letter. When she handed him the annulment papers Nate had filed, Jack's expression hardened. "Well, this changes everything," he said, tapping the documents. "If Nate officially annulled the transfer before his death, the house legally belongs to you, but proving that in court will require a fight. Rachel strikes me as someone who won't back down easily." "She's not just anyone," Emily said, her voice trembling. "She's dangerous. Nate said she manipulated him. I think she's done this before." Jack leaned back in his chair. "Then we need to dig into her past. If she has a history of fraud or coercion, that could strengthen your case." Enter Michael Grant, a private investigator with a reputation for uncovering the ugliest of truths. His office, tucked above a greasy diner, smelled faintly of fried onions, but Emily didn't care. She handed him a file of Rachel's documents, photos, and everything she had gathered from Nate's office. "Rachel Donovan," Michael mused, scrolling through her information on his computer. "That's not her real name." Emily blinked. "What?" "She's had at least 2 aliases," Michael said, pulling up records. "Rachel Martinez, Rachel Petrovsky. She's changed her name each time she's moved to a new city. Always the same pattern: get close to wealthy men, gain their trust, and convince them to transfer assets. Houses, businesses, bank accounts, you name it. She's a professional con artist." Emily's stomach churned. How did Nate not see this? Michael shrugged. "People like her are experts at what they do. They target vulnerabilities, play on emotions. She probably made him feel special, needed, and once she had her hooks in, it was game over." He handed Emily a folder. "Here's what I've found so far: former victims, questionable transactions, and a list of properties she's acquired under shady circumstances. This woman has left a trail of destruction wherever she's gone. Armed with the evidence, Emily and Jack built a strong case. They gathered testimonies from Rachel's previous victims, all of whom described eerily similar tactics. One man had lost his office building, another, an elderly widow, had been tricked into signing away her home. At the same time, Jack worked to validate the annulment papers Nate had filed. The notary who had helped Nate agreed to testify, confirming that Nate had acted of his own volition and had expressed clear intent to reverse the transfer before his death. Rachel, however, was not going down without a fight. One morning, Emily found a stack of photographs in her mailbox, pictures of Nate and Rachel together. They were smiling in a restaurant, walking in a park, even entering a hotel. On the back of each photo was a handwritten note: "Accept the truth. This was your life." Emily's hands shook as she shredded the photos, refusing to let Rachel's games break her resolve. But the psychological warfare didn't stop there. Rachel began showing up outside the house with potential buyers, loudly discussing renovation plans within earshot of Emily and her neighbors. "She's trying to intimidate you," Jack said when Emily called him in tears. "But don't let her. Every move she makes is just more evidence of harassment." The battle reached its peak in court. Rachel arrived with a team of high-powered lawyers, her icy demeanor unshaken, but Emily was ready. Jack presented the annulment documents, Nate's letter, and Michael's findings on Rachel's fraudulent past. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a damning portrait of Rachel's manipulation and deceit. Rachel's lawyers tried to discredit the evidence, but they couldn't counter the mountain of proof. The notary's testimony about Nate's intentions, combined with the overwhelming pattern of Rachel's behavior, was impossible to ignore. In the end, the judge ruled in Emily's favor, declaring her the rightful owner of the house and ordering an investigation into Rachel's activities. As Emily left the courthouse, the weight of months of grief, anger, and uncertainty finally began to lift. Nate had made mistakes, but he had tried to make things right. Now she had the chance to honor his memory by building a future for herself and their child, a future rooted in truth, resilience, and hope. The gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the start of a legal battle that would determine the future of everything Emily held dear. The room was a stark contrast to the warmth of her home, a place now shrouded in uncertainty thanks to Rachel Donovan's cold, calculated schemes. Emily sat at the defendant's table, flanked by Jack Hayes, her calm and confident attorney, and Sarah, her best friend and unwavering supporter. Across the aisle, Rachel sat poised, dressed impeccably in a gray suit that screamed sophistication. Her lawyers, a duo of sharp-looking men with polished briefcases, exuded confidence. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Porter, called the court to order. Her sharp eyes swept across the room, silently commanding respect. "Let us begin," she said firmly. Rachel's lead attorney rose, delivering an opening argument filled with legal jargon and attempts to paint Rachel as a victim of unfair accusations. He argued that Nate's decision to transfer the house had been entirely voluntary, pointing to the signed documents as evidence. Rachel sat motionless, her face a mask of calm, as her attorney painted a picture of a misunderstood businesswoman wrongfully targeted by a grieving widow. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stood with measured confidence. "This case is not just about the legalities of a property transfer," he began. "It's about manipulation, coercion, and a pattern of behavior that has left a trail of victims. We will prove that Nate Miller, under duress and manipulation, signed those documents, but that he took immediate steps to annul the transaction once he realized the gravity of his mistake." Jack's words landed like a hammer, shattering the pristine narrative Rachel's team had tried to construct. The first piece of evidence presented was the annulment paperwork. Jack walked the court through the timeline. Nate had signed over the house but had filed for annulment within days. The notary who had processed the annulment, James Wilson, took the stand next. "Mr. Miller was deeply troubled when he came to my office," Wilson testified. He said he had made a grave mistake and needed to reverse the transaction immediately. He was clear, deliberate, and insistent that the annulment be processed without delay. Rachel's lawyers tried to discredit Wilson, suggesting that Nate might have been coerced or influenced. But Wilson remained steadfast, his calm demeanor and meticulous documentation leaving little room for doubt. The courtroom grew tense as Michael Grant, the private investigator, took the stand. His testimony unveiled the darker layers of Rachel's life. Rachel Donovan is not who she claims to be, Michael began, his voice steady. Her real name is Rachel Petrovsky, and before that, Rachel Martinez. She has a documented history of changing identities, targeting wealthy men, and manipulating them into transferring assets. Michael presented evidence of Rachel's previous victims: an elderly widow who lost her home, a businessman whose office building was signed away, and a couple whose vacation property was fraudulently taken. Her methods are consistent, Michael continued. She identifies vulnerabilities, gains trust, and convinces her targets to act against their own best interests. Mr. Miller was no exception. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as he presented financial records, emails, and photographs that tied Rachel to a web of deceit. Rachel's attorneys objected, accusing Michael of painting a biased and irrelevant picture. But the judge allowed the evidence, stating, "If this pattern is relevant to the defendant's claims of manipulation, it deserves consideration." The most emotional moment came when Jack introduced Nate's letter as evidence. Emily's hands trembled as she held the piece of paper, its edges worn from her holding it so many times. "This is a letter written by Nate Miller to his wife, Emily, just days before his untimely death," Jack said. "It reveals his remorse, his recognition of the manipulation he was under, and his efforts to make things right." Jack read the letter aloud, his voice steady but filled with gravity. The courtroom fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a ghost of Nate himself. Rachel's composure cracked for the first time. Her hands clenched the edge of the table, her lips pressing into a thin line. The judge looked at her sharply. "Miss Donovan, do you have anything to say regarding the contents of this letter?" Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. "The letter is irrelevant," she said coolly. "The transaction was legal and binding at the time it was signed." But the damage was done. The sincerity in Nate's words and the timeline of his actions painted a picture of a man trying desperately to undo a mistake Rachel had orchestrated. Rachel's attorneys fought back with a fierce cross-examination, trying to portray Emily as a grieving widow using her emotions to cling to the house. "Mrs. Miller," one attorney said, his tone sharp, "isn't it true that your husband willingly signed these documents? That he never voiced any objections at the time of the transaction?" Emily took a deep breath, her voice steady as she replied, "At the time, I didn't know about the transaction, but Nate's actions afterward, his annulment of the transfer, his letter, proved that he regretted it deeply. He was manipulated. He wasn't himself." The attorney sneered. "So you're claiming your husband was incapable of making rational decisions?" Emily's eyes hardened. "I'm saying my husband made a mistake, one that he tried to fix. He wasn't incapable. He was misled by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate him." The courtroom drama reached its climax when Rachel herself took the stand. She remained calm and confident as she described her relationship with Nate, framing herself as a supportive partner who had helped him through difficult times. "I cared for Nate," she said, her voice laced with practiced sincerity. "He told me he was unhappy in his marriage, that he felt unappreciated. I never forced him to do anything. Everything he did was his choice." Jack's cross-examination, however, quickly dismantled her facade. "Miss Donovan," Jack began, "how many properties have you acquired from men who later regretted their decisions?" Rachel stiffened. "That's irrelevant. Each transaction was legal." "And yet," Jack pressed, "every transaction follows the same pattern. A vulnerable individual, promises of a better future, and assets signed over to you. Are we to believe this is all a coincidence?" Rachel's confidence wavered, and she faltered under Jack's relentless questioning. The final days of the trial were grueling, but Jack left no stone unturned. He presented evidence of Rachel's harassment, photos, testimonies from neighbors, and even surveillance footage showing the house to potential buyers while Emily still lived there. By the time closing arguments began, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver her verdict. Emily held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. After reviewing the evidence, Judge Porter began, it is clear that the original transaction, while legally executed, was annulled in accordance with proper legal procedures. Furthermore, the evidence presented paints a troubling picture of coercion and manipulation on the part of Ms. Donovan. Rachel's face fell, her mask of composure slipping. The court rules in favor of Emily Miller. The house remains in her possession. Additionally, the actions of Ms. Donovan will be referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential fraud and harassment. Emily's breath escaped in a sob of relief. She turned to Sarah, who squeezed her hand tightly, both of them blinking back tears. Rachel stood, her face pale and her shoulders tense as she left the courtroom. The once confident woman now looked small, her empire of lies beginning to crumble. That evening, back in her home, Emily stood in the living room, letting the quiet sink in. The house was hers again, and though Nate wasn't there to share in the victory, she felt his presence in every corner. She placed his letter in a frame on the mantel, a reminder not of his mistakes, but of his love and his efforts to make things right. As she sat down in the nursery, imagining the life she would build for her child, Emily realized that justice wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about reclaiming the life she and Nate had dreamed of. And now finally she could. Emily stood on the front porch of her house, the early morning sun bathing the garden in a warm, golden glow. The vibrant sunflowers Nate had planted swayed gently in the breeze, their bright faces turning toward the light. She inhaled deeply, the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers filling her lungs. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe freely. The house was hers, truly, completely hers. It was a victory hard won, but the battle was over, and the future stretched before her like a blank canvas. Inside, the house felt different, though nothing physical had changed. The walls still held the same pictures, the furniture was still in its familiar place, but the oppressive weight of uncertainty had lifted. The home was no longer a battleground, it was a sanctuary. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into preparing for her baby's arrival. The nursery, once an abstract idea, became a tangible project. She chose soft green walls to evoke a sense of calm and added whimsical touches, a mobile of stars and clouds, a bookshelf filled with picture books, and a plush armchair where she could rock her son to sleep. Sarah came over almost daily, bringing snacks, baby clothes, and her usual boundless energy. Emily, Sarah said one afternoon as they painted tiny clouds on the nursery ceiling, "I've never seen you this focused. It's like you've turned into some kind of supermom already." Emily laughed, dipping her brush into white paint. "I think it's the relief. For months, I felt like I was drowning. Now, I finally have something to look forward to." Sarah paused, her brush hovering midair. "Nate would be so proud of you," she said softly. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I like to think so. This house, this nursery, it's for him, too. It's our way of keeping his memory alive for the baby." As the nursery took shape, so did Emily's sense of purpose. She made lists of everything she needed, attended prenatal classes with Sarah, and even started a small vegetable garden in the backyard. It wasn't just about preparing for the baby, it was about rebuilding her life, one step at a time. Her neighbors, once distant during the chaos with Rachel, began to rally around her. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman next door, often stopped by with fresh muffins or advice on newborn care. 3 kids and 7 grandkids, she'd say with a laugh. I know a thing or two about babies. Even the younger couples in the neighborhood began to warm up, offering hand-me-down baby items and words of encouragement. It felt as though the community was piecing itself back together after being fractured by Rachel's manipulation. Despite the progress, there were moments of quiet grief. Late at night, when the house was still and the world seemed too big, Emily would sit in the living room and think of Nate. She kept his letter framed on the mantel, a reminder not of his mistakes, but of his love and the effort he made to fix what he had broken. Some nights, she would thumb through photo albums, reliving the moments that defined their life together. Their wedding day, their first Christmas in the house, lazy summer afternoons in the backyard. These memories didn't sting as much as they used to. Instead, they brought a bittersweet comfort, as if Nate was still a part of her journey. One evening, while organizing the attic, Emily stumbled upon a dusty box labeled Nate's Projects. Inside, she found an unfinished scrapbook he had been putting together, a collection of memories from their years in the house. Tickets from their first concert together, handwritten notes, and even a few Polaroids from their anniversary trips were scattered among the pages. Tears welled in her eyes as she flipped through it. Nate had been planning to surprise her, to immortalize the life they had built together. She decided to finish it, adding pages for their child and the new memories they would create. The seasons shifted, and summer's warmth began to soften into autumn. Emily's belly grew rounder, and with each kick and flutter, her anticipation for the future grew. At one of her prenatal appointments, the doctor revealed the baby's gender, a boy. Nathaniel, she said aloud in the car afterward, her voice firm but gentle. I'll call him Nathaniel, not because of what Nate did, but because of who he was. He loved fiercely, even when he made mistakes. That's the part of him I want to carry forward. Sarah, riding shotgun, smiled and reached over to squeeze Emily's hand. Nathaniel Miller, she said with approval. He's going to have one amazing mom. The closer Emily came to her due date, the more she reflected on how far she had come. The legal battles, the harassment, the doubt, it all felt like a distant nightmare now. Rachel had been dealt with, her schemes unraveled, and the house was no longer a symbol of pain, but of resilience. Jack Hayes, her attorney, kept her updated on Rachel's case. She's being investigated for fraud and harassment, he told Emily during a phone call. You likely won't hear from her again. She's facing serious legal consequences. Emily nodded, feeling a sense of closure. Rachel was no longer a shadow looming over her life. On a crisp September morning, Emily stood in the nursery, admiring her work. The crib was set up, the shelves were lined with toys and books, and the tiny dresser was filled with baby clothes neatly folded in drawers. She ran her hand over the edge of the crib, a sense of peace washing over her. This was her home, her future. And soon, the place where her son would take his first steps, speak his first words, and grow into the person he was meant to be. That evening, as she sat on the porch with a mug of tea, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She closed her eyes and felt the gentle breeze on her face, the soft rustle of leaves in the yard, and the faint sound of children playing down the street. She placed a hand on her belly, smiling as the baby kicked in response. We're going to be okay, she whispered. You and me, Nathaniel, we've got this. In the weeks leading up to her due date, Emily finished the scrapbook Nate had started. She added a section for the baby, photos of the nursery, ultrasound pictures, and a heartfelt letter she wrote one quiet afternoon. Dear Nathaniel, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand the story of how we got here. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wasn't sure we'd make it, but we did. And through it all, I loved you more than words can say. This house is more than just walls and a roof. It's a symbol of strength, love, and the determination to fight for what truly matters. Your dad made mistakes, but he loved us deeply, and that love is what carried us through. You're my greatest gift, Nathaniel. I can't wait to watch you grow, to see the person you'll become, and to fill this house with your laughter and joy. Love always. Mom. As the days grew shorter and the leaves began to turn, Emily found herself ready in every sense of the word. The house, once a place of turmoil, was now a haven of hope and possibility. Her battle had been won, and the life she was building for herself and Nathaniel was only just beginning. Standing on the porch one evening, she watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The world felt quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. In that moment, Emily knew one thing for certain. This was her home, her future, and nothing would ever take it away again. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this story. Emily's journey of heartbreak, resilience, and hope reminds us that even in the darkest times, we can find the strength to rebuild and move forward. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit and the enduring bonds of love. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Here, we share real life stories of triumph over adversity, stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the strength we all carry within. Your support means the world to us. By liking this video, sharing it with someone who might need a little inspiration, or leaving a comment, you're helping us spread these incredible stories to a wider audience. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Together, we can create a space where everyone feels seen, heard, and empowered. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, take care and remember, every story has the power to change lives, maybe even yours.